right, I think we're ready to go. Sorry for that. Technology is even harder outside than it is inside, I think. With the scripture song prayer service tonight, I have bumped up this evening's lesson to this morning, and it's the 7th and final lesson in this series, Eyewitnesses of Jesus, number 7. And I'd like to talk about the testimony of the evangelists. There are so many issues that we could have explored, and I think that I've crammed a lot into the previous 6 lessons and then a little bit in this 7th lesson. And yet, I want to tell you in no uncertain terms that I haven't said everything that there could be said on this issue. I'll give you 2 cases in point. Number 1, there's a whole lot more that could be said about archaeological pegs between outstanding archaeological findings that confirm the authenticity of certain details mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I've only scratched the surface on that. And one of the reasons I've done that is because I wanted to cover some of these other areas that get virtually no coverage and combine a lot of that into 7 lessons. And so I think that if you've been listening carefully, you've probably heard a thing or two that you've hardly ever considered before, and maybe some other things that you've considered quite a bit. But nonetheless, I've tried to look at a few other things that are very important, but often don't get adequately covered. Another thing that we could talk a whole lot more about is the fact that because the Gospels are under attack, that Jesus Christ of Nazareth is increasingly discredited in this culture, in this society. There are ways that you can take this information and use it in everyday conversations. And again, I've barely scratched that surface as well. I have said in a previous lesson that you could take some of the Wednesday night lessons that we did last year in the tactics quarter and ask certain questions when people bring up issues that are by way of attack, of minimizing the record of Jesus Christ or passing it off as mythological or legendary. You could simply ask the kinds of questions we asked during that quarter. What do you mean by that? What's your evidence? What's your rationale for coming to that conclusion? And then turn the corner by using some of the evidence that we presented these last 7 lessons. How does that view jive with Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C? And give them something really thick to chew on, and possibly cause some cognitive dissonance in their minds. If not in their minds, maybe in somebody else's mind, a third party who's actually witnessing the conversation, who might be a little more open-minded if that person is not open-minded. But nonetheless, we could spend a lot more time taking this and say, how do you actually use this in practical everyday conversations? If you're unsure of that, I would be happy to sit down with you or sit online with you and explore some of those issues. But nonetheless, these lessons have been recorded. You could go back and listen again, maybe even view most of them. We're doing that more and more with the WebEx, so you could actually see the PowerPoints and so on. And hope you take advantage of that. This is really important. The more that Christianity is marginalized in an increasingly secular society that dismisses it out of hand, the more we need to arm ourselves of these kinds of things as we defend the faith and are ready to give an answer that lies within us in a world full of darkness. In this last lesson, I would like to focus on the testimony of the evangelists. That is actually the title of a little book that was produced in the 1800s by Simon Greenleaf. He was a principal founder of the Harvard Law School, and the book was published in 1846. The full title is The Testimony of the Evangelist, Examined by the Rules of Evidence Administered in Courts of Justice. Simon Greenleaf was one of the outstanding legal scholars that this country had ever produced by the mid-1900s, or 19th century, mid-1800s. And what I'd like to do this morning is simply go by a basic outline of what his book covers. I'm not going to cover every detail he covers, but his book is still extremely valuable. And if you have an Amazon account, you can download the electronic version for free. And I would highly recommend that. It's very good stuff. Or you can buy a book if you'd like to do that as well. But just the first part of the book covers these matters in detail, and he covers some other things pertaining to the book. But one of the things he says at the very outset of his study is that in approaching the whole idea of weighing the testimony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what he calls the evangelists, the gospel writers, in weighing their testimony, you've got to approach this investigation with an open mind. He says, for example, in examining the evidences of the Christian religion, it is essential to the discovery of truth that we bring to the investigation a mind freed as far as possible from existing prejudice and open to conviction. There should be a readiness on our part to investigate with candor, to follow the truth wherever it may lead us, and to submit without reserve or objection to all the teachings of this religion if it be found to be of divine origin. And so that should go without saying, but we need to say it anyway, that people ought to approach an investigation of this with open-mindedness. Now, a lot of people don't. A lot of people in this society don't do that. And what you need to do for those people is to try to urge them to think outside the box and to think with an open mind, lest they come to a completely false conclusion about this. No one can come to a correct conclusion about anything if they're not open-minded. And there's no virtue in smallness of mind. There's no virtue in closed-mindedness on anybody's part. Go without saying, but it ought to be said because there are a lot of closed-minded people that need to open their minds on things that are most important. Also, this is not for the headstrong. It's interesting that he would make that point in 1846. If he made that point in 1846, I think it needs to be made just a little bit more in 2020. But this is what he says about that. Christianity does not profess to convince the perverse and headstrong, to bring irresistible evidence to the daring and profane, to vanquish the proud scorner, and to afford evidences from which the careless and perverse cannot possibly escape. This might go to destroy man's responsibility. All that Christianity professes is to propose such evidences as may satisfy the meek, the tractable, the candid, the serious inquirer. In other words, God hasn't designed this so that the evidence is so overwhelming that you don't have a responsibility to weigh it. Someone may say, well, if God would simply do X, Y, and Z, then I believe. And you're not God. But let me tell you, what God has done is enough if you're honest-minded and if you're humble-minded and you're willing to go wherever the truth leads you. It's not enough to overwhelm the skeptic who is absolutely determined to remain a skeptic, but it's enough for the honest-minded inquirer who really wants to come to terms with the truth. But you have to be humble, and God designed it that way. God in his infinite mercy is not going to spoon-feed this to proud, arrogant rebels who don't want to get it. But he is going to give it to humble people who really want it more than anything else. nature of the investigation that each of us personally must undertake if we come to terms with the truth of Jesus Christ and the eyewitnesses who testify concerning him. Foundation of our religion, Simon Greenleaf says, is a basis of fact. The fact of the birth, ministry, miracles, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. These are related by the evangelists as having actually occurred within their own personal knowledge. Our religion then rests on the credit due to these eyewitnesses. Are they worthy of implicit belief in the matters which they relate? This is the question. In all human tribunals in regard to persons testifying before them, and we propose to test the veracity of these witnesses by the same rules and means which are there employed. So you bring up Matthew to the witness stand, and Mark, and Luke, and John. And as they are testifying, you are sitting in the jury box. And you're applying the same rules of evidence to their testimony as you would if you were sitting in another jury in 2020 listening to someone else. And when you do that, you're weighing what they say with a whole range of human experience. You're weighing what they say with what can be known about the rules of evidence and eyewitness testimony. And you're essentially weighing possibility and probability in light of that. The burden of proof regarding the documents, we've addressed this just a bit in the previous lessons. Every document apparently ancient coming from the proper repository or custody and bearing on its face no evident marks of forgery, the law presumes to be genuine and devolves on the opposing party the burden of proving it to be otherwise. That's simply a rule of law and applies here just as much as in any other area. I spent a whole quarter in the previous year talking about the evidence for how the biblical documents came down to us, how we got the Bible, and spent a little bit of time touching on that with regard to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Won't do that but anymore this morning, but simply to point out that the credibility factor is rather high on the charts when you are dealing with the transmission of the documents and with the circumstances surrounding the origin of the documents. We have touched on that in the previous lessons, and if you'd like to do so more, I could certainly do so. Again, weighing possibility and probability in eyewitness testimony. Simon Greenleaf says, in trials of fact by oral testimony, the proper inquiry is not whether it is possible that the testimony may be false, but whether there is sufficient probability that it is true. In other words, the general default in any court of law, when weighing the evidence of the testimony of someone who is testifying concerning that evidence, is to give the benefit of the doubt, unless there is sufficient probability to doubt it. As far as proving the case is concerned, a proposition of fact is proved when which truth is established by competent and satisfactory evidence. In the absence of circumstances which generate suspicion, every witness is presumed to be credible. Until the contrary is shown, the burden of proof of impeaching his credibility rather lying on the objector. In other words, who has the burden of proof here? You automatically should give doubt unless you have overwhelming evidence to impeach his credibility, because the natural default lies with him telling the truth. Even chronic liars can tell the truth once in a while. In fact, if a chronic liar got onto the witness stand and said, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and so on and so forth, you generally even give that person the benefit of the doubt. But if his character is impeached and there are other factors that come into play, then you may be scratching your head and there may be all kinds of question marks that come into play. But our general default, even when talking to anyone else in life, is to automatically assume that when someone tells us something, that that person is telling us the truth. Now, there are liars out there, but I don't believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are lying. And where they have sound mind and sound faculties to be able to take in and to hear that which actually occurred. Thirdly, their number and consistency of their testimony. When one person tells us something, that one person can tell us a big fish story. But when 2 people and 3 people and 4 people and 5 people are telling us essentially the same thing, then the credibility factor goes up quite a bit. You have independent verification. And so is it consistent, and are there multiple? On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact is to be established, is a biblical principle. Fourthly, the conformity of their testimony with experience. Are there pegs of human nature that we can rely on in weighing what they say with everything we know to be true about time and space in this world in which we live? Or do we have someone who's telling us just another flying saucer story without a whole lot of credibility? And I'm not saying that a flying saucer story could not be true, but in the range of experience, do we have enough to go on in terms of the credibility factor there? Fifthly, the coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. In other words, are there external pegs, external witnesses that bear on the issue? When you look at these 5 areas, honesty, were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John honest? I'm almost embarrassed to bring that one up, because if there's one thing that strikes me about them, it's these men are not known for their chronic lying, not exactly. And again, the general default is to assume people are telling the truth unless you can impeach their credibility and unless there's a prevailing motive to do otherwise. But if anything, all I see here is integrity of the highest character. And when you think about what they actually say, they are presenting a message, and the core of the message enjoins everybody who comes to terms with it to tell the truth at all times and to be totally honest. And you look at this a little more deeply, they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling the truth. They sealed their testimony, most of them, with their blood. They had nothing to gain, everything to lose by telling the truth, but they told it anyway. And they were good men. Everything that we can conclude about what they were doing in life and how they were going about life suggests that these were not only good men, they were some of the best men that you would ever know if you were to meet them. They were simply following the truth wherever it led, and they were testifying concerning it. Everything we know about them suggests that. So you look at the second factor, their ability. Were they in a position to know these things? Were they in a position to observe them firsthand? Did they know the facts of the case? And again, you begin to analyze that. And there's no question that Jesus has these disciples and that these 12 apostles form the core of what becomes the earliest Jerusalem church. And then you work out from there, and it becomes rather obvious, both in terms of them saying, we are witnesses of these things, but also appealing to the eyewitness testimony of the crowds, even on the day of Pentecost. You also know about these things. Had there been any tendency to depart from the material facts of the case, hostile witnesses would have arisen and said, that's not how it happened, I was there. And yet they're constantly appealing to that. Constantly. Being an eyewitness is the most fundamental requirement of being an apostle. They had to be eyewitnesses, and when Judas went by the wayside, they had to replace him. Being an eyewitness from the baptism of John till the resurrection had to be a requirement to join this elite band of those who would testify on behalf of Jesus. The number and consistency. There's overlapping testimony of multiple eyewitnesses. If you don't get anything else out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, overlapping testimony. On the periphery of things, there may be some fine details that may at first glance give the appearance of being contradictory. But then when you look more closely, there are ways to see how the testimony comes together. We've looked at a few of those things during these lessons. But the testimony generally does not cancel itself out. They do not cancel each other out. They come with different perspectives, but it's the same core truth. And there are no discrepancies there sufficient to discredit the central issue of who Jesus was and essentially what he did, what he said, the miracles that he performed, the resurrection, the ascension, and so on. The testimony is uniform on that, even though the perspectives are vastly different. Conformity with experience. The reactions are typically human, and what they were experiencing is not always in the range of our experience. Let's face it, we haven't witnessed all of these great miracles that they witnessed. But yes, it is also true that truth is stranger than fiction. And if God were to prove a case to human beings and send his son to this earth, aren't miracles what you would expect? To prove that this is no natural event, this is supernatural through and through. Miraculous intervention is exactly what you would expect. But even to that, there is this human element in reacting to it. Mary says in Luke 1:34, how can this be, since I am a virgin? And the answer of the angel is nothing will be impossible with God. Luke 1:34 and verse 37. Or Mark 5 and verse 41. After Jesus calms the winds and the waves, peace be still, and everything is calm. And the apostles are saying to one another, who in the world is this, that even the winds and the water obey him? Very human. Very human. They're not gullible. They're not gullible at all. They're simply, and get this, amazed by Jesus. That's what's happening. They're just in constant amazement at what they're witnessing. They can hardly believe their eyes at first, but then the evidence becomes so overwhelming to them that they come to the only possible conclusions about it. And then you have confirmation with collateral circumstances. And we've talked about history, archaeology, pagan witnesses, Christian witnesses outside the New Testament, local details, external evidences, all verified time after time after time after time with amazing consistency. And again, I've only scratched the surface on all that. But there's nothing contrived there, nothing of invention by a wild imagination out of thin air. There's so many examples of simple honesty that underscore what we just looked at, those 5 elements. You have the claims of Jesus in the Gospels that are somewhat cryptic at first and then revealed gradually as if in stages and then stated in unsensational language. And eventually, the apostles come to the inevitable conclusions about who Jesus is. He tells them that he's going to die in cryptic language at first, and then he all of a sudden speaks the matter plainly. Peter takes him aside, says, "Lord, this will never happen to you. I'm not going to let it happen," basically. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not minding the things of man, but you're not minding the things of God, but the things of man." Puts Peter in his place. And have you ever noticed the apostles don't come off very well? They don't even try to make themselves look good. They don't seem to understand half of what Jesus says. He's constantly saying things and it just goes right over their heads. They don't look just like Luke 12. You have so many thousands of people, verse 1, had gathered together. They were trampling on one another. And Jesus says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops." In other words, all these private conversations that we're having, I do this public teaching, then we have these private conversations that they're, in some cases at least, these private conversations are going to be part of the public record. If I had heard that and understood it, I would have said, okay. Well, in fact, yesterday when I was interviewing Talon, I said, this is kind of like the difference between a private prayer and a public prayer. I said, we're having a private conversation, but you have other people listening to this, so be careful what you say. And that's how it was with these 12 apostles. They said some stupid things. Or they said some things that any one of us would have said. Because they were dealing with someone who was so far beyond them. And when it was all said and done, all the pieces began to come together. And think of the 2020 hindsight, being making our vision 2020 or perfect when we see everything in hindsight. All these after the fact epiphanies they would have had. That's what he meant. I didn't get it at the time. Over and over again. That kind of thing happens. And I don't even have time to begin really exploring this with you, but Matthew 16 and verse 17, after Jesus takes essentially an opinion poll, who do men say that I am? Well, some say you're Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am? Well, Peter replies, well, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds in Matthew 16:17, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father who is in heaven. God did not reveal that to Peter in a burst of visionary inspiration. God revealed that to Peter when the cumulative force of the evidence of everything Jesus said and did became so overwhelming, it was obvious to Peter. It was a revelation that gradually dawned on him that became inescapable. It's obvious, Lord. You are the Christ, the Son of God. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. That's right. And even then, even after they confess certain things about Jesus, he tells them to shush about it. Hush up. This is not for the public record until after we're done. After the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And this goes to the whole world. Then, and if they were inventing all of this, all of those nuances, do you think that they would be in the gospel record about a gradual coming to terms with all of this? Those nuances are there because they represent what really happened. So when we cross-examine them, by committing to so much detail, they've opened themselves up to additional scrutiny, and we've looked at that scrutiny in previous lessons. They convey a naturalness of character portraits rarely found in works of fiction. The accounts are devoid of exaggeration or fanfare. It's just the unvarnished, simple truth. Yes, they're constantly in amazement, but it's just the unvarnished, simple truth that you see. It's the apocryphal gospels that were produced by human imaginations in the 2nd century that contain sensational, ridiculous things. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that contain those things. Power of simple truth speaks for itself. It has the smell of truth. It has the look of truth. It has the feel of truth. And when all is said and done, the portrait of Jesus that emerges in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John is unique in all of literature. There's no one like him. Simon Greenleaf concludes, he says, he is represented in every variety of situation in life, from the height of worldly grandeur amid the acclamations of an admiring multitude to the deepest abyss of human degradation and woe, apparently deserted of God and man, yet everywhere he is the same, displaying a character of unearthly perfection, symmetrical in all its proportions and encircled with the splendor more than human. When you look at Jesus in Matthew, it's the same Jesus in Mark, same in Luke, same in John. Perfect character. And so the verdict, Simon Greenleaf's verdict was either the men of Galilee were men of superlative wisdom, of extensive knowledge and experience, of deeper skill in the arts of deception than any and all others before or after them, or they have truly stated the astonishing things which they saw. I'm going to wind up this lesson and this series by simply saying this. Number one, truth has nothing to fear from investigation. It doesn't. We live in a world of cancel culture in so many respects, and I get frustrated. And I think I get so frustrated, I'm going to preach some lessons on this, but it's maybe another series of lessons. You better beware the day when Christians start getting canceled right and left, because that day is really, really close, I think. It's already here in some respects. We have nothing to fear. We have nothing to position, because this is true. I don't care who says it is false. We have the truth. And no matter what spin others may put on it, no matter what attempts there may be to intimidate us, or to marginalize us, or to discredit us, we have one great advantage. And no one can take it away from us. Jesus Christ of Nazareth is really the person these eyewitnesses saw and heard. He is. No one can legitimately deny that and remain true. He's the Son of God. He's the Savior of the world. And we so very much want him to be not only our Savior, but yours as well. If you've never stood up publicly and named his name, if you've never been baptized into Christ unashamedly, realizing that he died for you so that you can live for him, and please consider doing it. If you're outside with me in the parking lot, we're going to stand and sing a song of invitation.